The most powerful room in the world fell silent because of a child. It was supposed to be adorable. If you're new to this channel, just subscribe now and say it in the comment section. That was the word the event coordinator had used 3 times that morning. Adorable optics. A 10-year-old Nigerian-American boy standing behind the presidential podium for a ceremonial Kid President for a Day initiative. A feel-good segment. A harmless headline. A social media moment. No one expected silence to feel this heavy. The White House East Room pulsed with movement long before Malik Adeyemi arrived. Secret Service agents murmured into their sleeves. Senior advisors adjusted cufflinks and rehearsed polite smiles. Senators stood in small clusters, trading restrained jokes about how they hoped the young commander-in-chief wouldn't declare recess for Congress. Camera crews lined the back wall, red lights blinking like patient eyes. Outside, Washington shimmered under a pale blue sky, but inside, tension hung strangely thick for what was meant to be a symbolic ceremony. Malik stepped through the tall doorway holding his mother's hand. He was smaller than most people expected. Slim shoulders. Neatly pressed navy suit. A red tie his father had helped him knot twice because the first attempt looked like it survived a hurricane, according to Dr. Tunde Adeyemi. Mrs. Amaka Adeyemi leaned down and whispered, "Remember, it's just for fun. Smile. Speak clearly." Malik nodded, but his eyes weren't searching for cameras. They were studying the room. He noticed the way the general stood slightly apart from the politicians. He noticed who laughed too loudly. He noticed which advisors carried folders and which carried nothing at all. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced warmly, "please welcome our kid president for the day, Malik Adeyemi." Applause erupted. It was polished applause. Practiced applause. The kind reserved for ribbon cuttings and charity luncheons. Malik released his mother's hand and walked toward the podium alone. His father watched from the second row, pride swelling in his chest. "He's going to be great," he whispered to Zara, Malik's 14-year-old sister. Zara folded her arms. "He's not here to be cute." Dr. Adeyemi chuckled. "He's 10. Zara didn't smile. "Exactly." Malik reached the podium. It had been adjusted lower to accommodate his height. He placed both hands on the sides and looked out at the sea of faces. The teleprompter glowed. He didn't look at it. For weeks, while the media buzzed about the ceremonial presidency, Malik had been doing something no one had assigned him to do. He had been reading budget summaries, public policy breakdowns, emergency housing statistics, education funding disparities. He had asked his sister to help explain unfamiliar words. He had watched congressional hearings instead of cartoons. He had taken notes in a blue spiral notebook titled simply, "Questions." The program organizers had sent a cheerful packet outlining his schedule, photo session, brief symbolic signing of a mock resolution about healthy school lunches, short scripted speech thanking public servants, and then a meet and greet. Nothing controversial. Nothing real. But Malik had asked a quiet question during orientation that made the coordinator blink. "If I'm president," he had said slowly, "is it real?" The woman had laughed lightly. "Well, symbolically real." "But do I have the authority?" he pressed. There had been legal conversations after that. Now, standing behind the podium, he understood something the adults had underestimated: the temporary authority granted to him for the program had not been purely decorative. For 24 hours, under carefully drafted provisions, he could issue limited executive directives within pre-approved discretionary categories. They assumed he wouldn't know how to use them. The applause faded. Malik leaned closer to the microphone. It amplified the smallest breath. "Good morning," he began. His voice was steady. Clear. "Thank you for trusting me with today." Soft laughter rippled. Trusting. It sounded charming coming from a child. He scanned the front row. Senators. Cabinet members. Advisors. His parents. Then he said something that didn't belong in a scripted ceremony. "I've been reading your reports." The laughter faltered. A senator coughed. Malik continued calmly. "The housing report from last quarter. The infrastructure brief from the Energy Committee. The education disparity summary." Several heads turned toward the Chief of Staff. This was not on the teleprompter. Malik's fingers tightened slightly on the podium. "I noticed something," he said. "We talk a lot about future investments. But some people don't have a safe place to sleep tonight." The room shifted. This wasn't adorable. Dr. Adeyemi leaned forward in his seat. "What is he doing?" he whispered under his breath. Zara didn't answer. Malik glanced briefly at the teleprompter screen, where the prepared speech waited patiently, untouched. He looked back at the room. "I know today is supposed to be symbolic," he said. "But symbols are powerful. They show what we care about." A senior advisor stepped slightly toward the stage, uncertain whether to intervene. Malik noticed. He didn't rush. He spoke the way his mother taught him when explaining something important, slow enough that no one could misunderstand. "If I only have one day," he continued, "then I don't want it to be pretend." A murmur passed through the audience. The master of ceremonies forced a smile. "Of course, Malik, and we're all so inspired by your..." Malik gently raised a hand. The gesture was polite. But it stopped the interruption. "I'd like to begin by seeing the current federal discretionary event fund balance," he said. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. That fund wasn't part of the script. It was typically used for official galas, ceremonies, international hospitality events, non-essential expenditures. A budget advisor whispered urgently to the Chief of Staff. "He can't mean now." Malik waited. His eyes were not defiant. They were patient. "Is that possible?" he asked. The Chief of Staff studied him carefully. There was no mischief in his face. No confusion. Only intention. She nodded once to an aide. "Bring the numbers," she said quietly. The aide hurried out. Across the room, journalists leaned forward, fingers hovering above keyboards. Dr. Adeyemi exhaled slowly. "He told us he wanted to make it meaningful," he murmured. Mrs. Adeyemi clasped her hands together tightly. "Meaningful is different from this." Malik stood calmly as the room filled with a new kind of energy, not celebratory, but alert. Within minutes, a slim folder was placed on the podium beside him. He opened it carefully. The pages trembled slightly, not from his nerves, but from the air conditioning draft. He scanned the total. Then he looked up again. "If this money isn't already committed," he said evenly, "I'd like to discuss where it could do more than decorate a room." The words were simple. But they landed heavily. One of the senators shifted in his chair. "Mr. President," he said with a faint smile, clearly emphasizing the novelty, "those allocations are carefully planned months in advance." Malik nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. I read that." A few people stiffened. He had read that. "And I also read," he continued, "that emergency housing requests in 5 major cities exceeded available funds last quarter." The room went very still. Malik wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't performing. He was thinking. And for the first time since the morning began, the people in that room were no longer looking at a child playing dress-up. They were looking at someone who had come prepared. The cameras kept rolling. The applause never returned. And somewhere between the polished speeches and the untouched teleprompter, the ceremony stopped being adorable. It became real. The silence did not break. It thickened. Malik stood behind the podium, the slim federal spending folder open before him. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, loud now in the absence of applause. Every camera lens in the East Room was pointed directly at him. He ran his finger down the page once more. Unallocated discretionary event funds, he read quietly. Projected surplus for this quarter. A senior budget analyst cleared his throat. Mr. President, those figures are provisional. Malik looked up. Provisional means they're not spent yet, right? The analyst hesitated. Technically. Malik nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. Behind him, the American flag hung perfectly still. Across the room, whispers began weaving between officials. This is off script. Who approved this? Can we redirect the program? The Chief of Staff, Mrs. Ifunanya Okonkwo, did not whisper. She watched. She had met heads of state who masked ambition with charm. She had seen political theater from people 3 times Malik's age. What she saw now was neither. It was clarity. Malik adjusted the microphone slightly closer. If those funds are unused, he said evenly, I'd like to propose a temporary reallocation for emergency housing support in 5 cities where overflow shelters reported capacity failures last quarter. A senator leaned back in disbelief. You can't just. Malik turned toward him politely. Sir, under the temporary executive authority granted today, I can issue limited discretionary directives within pre-approved categories. He paused. Housing crisis response qualifies. The room froze again. The legal advisor who had drafted the symbolic program outline felt his stomach tighten. Malik was correct. The authority had been included as a formality, assuming no child would examine its boundaries. They hadn't accounted for Malik. Dr. Tunde Adeyemi pressed his lips together in astonishment. He had always known his son was thoughtful. Curious. But this was different. This wasn't curiosity. This was intent. Malik continued, calm and precise. I'm not asking to rewrite the budget. I'm asking to use what hasn't been used yet. An aide hurried to Mrs. Okonkwo and whispered, if we deny him, it will look worse on camera. She nodded once. Malik looked down at the folder again. How much of this surplus is flexible? The budget analyst swallowed. Approximately $38 million, subject to formal reclassification. Gasps rippled faintly through the room. Malik did not react to the number emotionally. He absorbed it. 38 million, he repeated. How many emergency housing units does that fund temporarily? The analyst hesitated. It depends on city cost variances. Give me an estimate. Several thousand short-term placements. Possibly more if coordinated with local agencies. Malik inhaled slowly. Then for the next 24 hours, he said clearly, I'm directing that unused discretionary event funds be temporarily reallocated toward emergency housing stabilization in the 5 cities reporting the highest shelter overflow last quarter. The words hung in the air. No flourish. No raised voice. Just a decision. The master of ceremonies looked as if he might faint. A general in the second row exchanged a look with another officer. This was no longer ceremonial. A journalist whispered urgently into her phone. He just did it. He actually redirected funds. Malik placed both hands firmly on the podium. I want written confirmation sent to city housing departments within the hour, he added. A senior advisor stood abruptly. Mr. President, perhaps we should discuss logistical complications before formalizing. Malik met his eyes. Not confrontational. Just steady. Are there complications to helping people sleep indoors tonight? The advisor faltered. It's not that simple. I know, Malik said gently. That's why you're here. A faint murmur of uncomfortable recognition moved across the audience. Zara felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't rebellion. It was something sharper. Responsibility. Mrs. Adeyemi squeezed her husband's hand tightly. He's going to make enemies, she whispered. Dr. Adeyemi responded quietly, he's making a point. The chief of staff stepped forward at last. "Prepare the directive," she said firmly to her team. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Pens moved. Phones lit up. Staff members exited briskly. The machinery of government had shifted direction because a 10-year-old asked why it couldn't. Malik watched the flurry of movement without triumph. He did not smile. Instead, he flipped to the next page in his notebook, the small blue spiral notebook he had brought tucked inside his suit jacket. He opened it carefully. "Next," he said. Several officials visibly stiffened. "There's more," a senator muttered. Malik looked toward the housing advisor. "When those emergency placements are processed, I'd like transparency reports published within 72 hours. Clear numbers. Clear locations. Clear costs." The housing advisor blinked. "Transparency reports." "Yes," Malik replied. "If we can celebrate spending, we can report it too." A journalist at the back whispered, "This kid is dismantling optics in real time." The chief of staff folded her arms thoughtfully. "Transparency builds trust," she said aloud, almost to herself. Malik nodded in agreement. He wasn't attacking anyone. He wasn't accusing. He was asking the questions adults often postponed. One of the senators leaned toward a colleague. "He'll lose steam soon." But Malik wasn't running on adrenaline. He was running on preparation. He closed the housing folder and slid it aside. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "Now I'd like to address infrastructure." A faint collective groan moved through the room. The Energy Task Force representatives exchanged uneasy glances. Malik adjusted his tie slightly. In the education brief, he continued, "It states that multiple low-income school districts reported unsafe heating and cooling systems last winter." An energy advisor responded cautiously. "Yes, but those upgrades require long-term planning, Anne." Malik lifted his blue notebook. "I highlighted something," he said softly. Luxury modernization projects received early approvals in districts that already met safety standards. The room went silent again. He looked directly at the energy advisor. "If some schools are unsafe, why are safe schools being upgraded first?" The question was simple. It cut deeper than accusation. The advisor shifted. "Funding pathways differ." Malik nodded thoughtfully. "So the pathway matters more than the students." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. The chief of staff spoke carefully. "Malik, policy sequencing is complex." "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm asking." He took a breath. "For the remainder of today, I want an emergency review of pending luxury infrastructure upgrades in districts that already meet safety standards. If those funds can legally be paused or partially redirected toward unsafe school repairs, I want that option presented before midnight." A collective stillness spread through the East Room. This was no longer symbolic. This was structural. One reporter whispered, "He's forcing a moral audit." Dr. Adeyemi sat motionless, stunned. He had spent years in academic research analyzing systems. Malik was challenging them in real time. Mrs. Adeyemi's eyes glistened, not from fear, but from recognition. She had seen this before. When Malik was 7, he had refused to accept that a classmate couldn't afford lunch. He had quietly organized 3 other children to share snacks until the teacher noticed. He did not understand indifference. Now the indifference had scale. An energy official leaned toward Mrs. Okonkwo. "If we comply, we disrupt contracts." She responded evenly, "If we don't, we look afraid of a child." Malik waited. He didn't fidget. He didn't rush. He understood something instinctively: silence forces decisions. Finally, the chief of staff gave a short nod. "Prepare the review." The directive was spoken quietly. But its impact roared. Phones buzzed. Staff scattered. Assistants hurried through side doors. The machinery shifted again. Malik closed his notebook gently. He looked out at the room, at faces that were no longer amused, no longer indulgent. They were alert, engaged, measured. For the first time that day, he allowed himself a small, restrained smile. Not because he had surprised them, but because they were listening. He leaned into the microphone once more. "I know today was supposed to be symbolic," he said. "But symbols show what we value." He glanced at the untouched teleprompter again. Then he looked back at the people entrusted with power long after his 24 hours would end. "We still have 20 hours left," he added calmly. And this time, no one laughed. The East Room no longer felt like a ceremony hall. It felt like a command center. Staff moved quickly now, not with polite efficiency but with urgency. Assistants slipped in and out of side corridors carrying tablets instead of folders. Phones vibrated constantly. Conversations were shorter, sharper. Malik watched it all without speaking. He had expected resistance. What he hadn't expected was how quickly resistance turned into momentum once decisions were spoken aloud. Mrs. Ifunanya Okonkwo stepped closer to the podium. "Housing directives are being processed," she said quietly. "Preliminary confirmations from 2 cities already." Malik nodded. "Thank you." She studied him carefully. "You understand this creates ripple effects?" "Yes," he replied. "That's the point." A faint, almost reluctant smile touched her lips. Across the room, a senior senator leaned toward a colleague. "We let this go too far." The colleague whispered back, "If we stop him now, it becomes a headline we can't control." Near the back, reporters were no longer pretending to be casual observers. They were narrating history in real time. 10-year-old president redirects federal funds. Kid president challenges infrastructure priorities. Malik turned another page in his blue notebook. "Next," he said. A visible tension tightened the shoulders of several department heads. Mrs. Okonkwo exhaled softly. "What is it, Mr. President?" Malik looked directly at her. "I'd like to speak with the Energy Task Force." A few officials exchanged alarmed glances. "That would require coordination," one advisor said cautiously. "They're in session." "Then connect me," Malik replied. There was no impatience in his tone. Just clarity. Mrs. Okonkwo hesitated only a second before nodding to an aide. "Set up the call." Secure line. Within minutes, a secure speaker system was placed at the podium. A red light blinked as the line established connection. The room grew still again. "Energy Task Force briefing line," a voice answered crisply. Mrs. Okonkwo gestured to Malik. He stepped slightly closer to the microphone. "Good afternoon," he began calmly. "This is President Malik Adeyemi." There was a brief, stunned pause on the other end. "Mr. President," the voice responded cautiously. Malik continued. "I've reviewed the recent infrastructure allocation summaries. I have a question." Papers shuffled audibly through the speaker. "Yes, sir." If schools in low-income neighborhoods reported unsafe heating and cooling systems last winter, Malik said clearly, why were modernization upgrades in already compliant districts approved ahead of them? Silence. In the East Room, you could hear someone inhale. On the line, a different voice joined in. Funding streams vary by jurisdiction. Malik nodded slightly, though they couldn't see him. "I understand that. But is there a legal mechanism to pause non-essential upgrades in compliant districts until unsafe systems are addressed?" The task force members did not answer immediately. A third voice spoke, slower. "Technically, emergency review provisions exist. But invoking them requires executive direction." Malik's eye shifted briefly to Mrs. Okonkwo. She did not interrupt. "Then I'm invoking them," Malik said. A murmur rippled through the East Room like wind across tall grass. On the line, someone cleared their throat. "Sir, that would delay ongoing projects." "Are those projects preventing children from learning safely today?" Malik asked gently. "No, sir." "Then delay them." The words were not loud, but they carried weight. In the East Room, a senator whispered sharply, "This is political suicide." Another replied under his breath, "For who?" Malik continued, his voice steady. "I want a report by 8 p.m. outlining which luxury or non-essential upgrades can be paused or partially redirected toward districts flagged for safety risks." A brief pause. "Understood, Mr. President," the voice on the line responded. "And one more thing," Malik added. The entire room seemed to lean closer. "When you prepare that report, I want it written in plain language. Not just for officials. For parents." There was a longer silence this time. "Plain language," the task force member repeated. "Yes," Malik said. "If it affects families, they should understand it without needing a law degree." Across the East Room, a journalist mouthed the words, "Wow." Mrs. Amaka Adeyemi pressed her hand against her chest. Pride and fear warred inside her. The call ended with formal acknowledgements. The red light on the speaker went dark. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Not because a child had spoken, but because he had been answered. Malik stepped back slightly from the microphone. He looked at the rows of officials. "I'm not trying to embarrass anyone," he said softly. "I'm trying to understand why urgent problems wait." The honesty in his tone disarmed more effectively than accusation ever could. A cabinet member finally spoke aloud. "Mr. President, change requires coordination. Systems are complex." Malik nodded respectfully. "I know. But complexity shouldn't become an excuse." No one had an immediate response. Dr. Tunde Adeyemi felt something shift inside him. He had spent years lecturing about systems thinking, about structural inertia. Malik wasn't rejecting complexity. He was confronting complacency. Mrs. Okonkwo stepped forward again. "Housing confirmations from 3 cities," she said quietly. "Funds are being received." A ripple of whispers spread through the journalists. "It's happening. This isn't symbolic anymore." Malik allowed himself a slow breath. "Good," he said. He glanced at his notebook once more. There were fewer pages left than when the day began. He closed it carefully. "We have 19 hours left," he said. The sentence landed differently now. Earlier, it had sounded like a novelty. Now, it sounded like a countdown. A senior advisor approached cautiously. "Mr. President, perhaps it would be wise to take a short break." Malik tilted his head slightly. "Are the housing families taking a break?" The advisor faltered. Mrs. Okonkwo intervened smoothly. "A brief transition, then. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. Malik considered this. He nodded once. As he stepped away from the podium, reporters immediately began speaking into cameras. "This is unprecedented. Real directive signed under temporary executive authority. Departments responding live." In the second row, Zara leaned toward her father. They thought he'd smile and wave. Dr. Adeyemi exhaled slowly. They didn't realize he was watching. Malik walked toward his parents. His mother knelt slightly to meet his eyes. "Are you okay?" "Yes," he said simply. "Do you understand what you're doing?" she asked gently. He looked back toward the podium, where officials were now clustered in urgent conversation. "I'm asking them to do what they already said they wanted to do," he replied. Mrs. Adeyemi blinked back sudden tears. Across the room, 2 senators argued in hushed tones. This sets a dangerous precedent. It sets a moral one. Staffers moved like currents in different directions. The White House press room was already filling beyond capacity. And for the first time that day, something unexpected spread beyond policy circles. Public attention. News alerts flashed across phones nationwide. A 10-year-old was not playing president. He was governing. Malik stood quietly beside his family as aides prepared for the next session. He didn't look triumphant. He looked thoughtful. Mrs. Okonkwo approached him once more. "Mr. President," she said carefully, "you've already shifted 2 major conversations today." Malik met her gaze. "Good," he replied. She studied him for a long moment. "You realize powerful people don't enjoy being questioned publicly?" Malik nodded. "Then maybe they should answer publicly." For a brief second, Mrs. Okonkwo forgot he was 10. The 30-minute transition ended quickly. As Malik turned back toward the podium, the atmosphere had changed entirely. No one saw him as symbolic anymore. He wasn't there to pose. He wasn't there to decorate. He was there to decide. And powerful people were listening. By the time Malik returned to the podium, the East Room no longer felt like a room. It felt like a mirror, reflecting not just power, but accountability. Word had spread far beyond Washington. Television screens in living rooms across America now displayed the same image, a 10-year-old boy in a Navy suit standing behind the presidential seal, speaking with unsettling calm. In Chicago, a mother in a small apartment turned up the volume. In Atlanta, a school principal paused a staff meeting. In Houston, a city housing coordinator refreshed her email and whispered, "The funds just came through." Back in the East Room, the air felt charged. Malik adjusted the microphone slightly. "I'd like to give a short national address," he said. A flicker of hesitation crossed several faces. Mrs. Okonkwo stepped forward. "We can arrange a live broadcast." "Thank you," Malik replied. Within minutes, additional cameras were positioned. A red light blinked on. The seal behind him gleamed under bright white lights. His parents stood toward the side now. No longer in the center. Watching, but not interfering. A producer's voice echoed softly, "We're live in 5, 4, 3. Malik inhaled slowly. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but softer than before. "I only have 24 hours, he began. Across the nation, conversation stopped. "But you've had decades." The sentence traveled farther than anyone in that room anticipated. In the East Room, several department heads stiffened. Malik continued. "I've heard people say change takes time. That systems are complicated. That there are procedures." He paused. "I believe that's true. But I also believe something else." He leaned slightly closer to the microphone. "Maybe change doesn't only take time. Maybe it takes courage." The room went completely still. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't blaming. He was challenging. Mrs. Okonkwo felt the weight of that distinction immediately. Malik glanced briefly toward the rows of officials seated before him. "Today, we redirected unused funds to emergency housing," he said. "We initiated a review of infrastructure priorities for unsafe schools. Those are small steps compared to the size of the problems." In a newsroom in New York, a senior anchor whispered, "He's framing this like a statesman." Malik continued, voice calm and clear. "But I don't want today to end with headlines. I want it to end with commitments." A murmur rippled faintly through the East Room. He turned slightly, scanning the department head seated in the first rows. "So I have a request," he said. The word request sounded almost gentle. "I'm asking each department represented here to publicly commit to one measurable action within 30 days. The silence sharpened. "Not a promise," Malik clarified. "Not a press statement. A measurable action." A senator leaned toward a colleague. "He can't mandate that." His colleague replied quietly, "No. But he can ask." Malik's eyes moved across the room deliberately. "Something specific." Something people can track. Something that helps someone who doesn't have a lobbyist. The sentence landed heavily. A journalist at the back whispered, he just reframed the entire power structure. Malik placed both hands firmly on the podium. I won't be president tomorrow, he continued. But you will still be in your positions. Several officials shifted in their seats. So before midnight, he said, I'm asking you to stand up and state one action you will complete in 30 days. And I'm asking the press to record it. The tension in the room became visible. Not explosive. Not chaotic. But undeniable. Mrs. Okonkwo felt the eyes of every camera pivot between her and the department heads. One housing official stood slowly. Mr. President, she began carefully, our department will publish a full transparency report within 30 days detailing housing allocation efficiency improvements. Pen scratched furiously in reporters' notebooks. Another official rose. Our infrastructure office will accelerate safety audits in all districts flagged last quarter and release public summaries. A third stood. The education department will implement a simplified public dashboard tracking repair progress. Each commitment added weight to the moment. Each statement turned words into expectations. Malik did not smile. He listened. One by one, department representatives rose. Some spoke confidently. Others hesitated before speaking. But none refused. The cameras captured every expression: resolve, discomfort, determination. Across the country, viewers leaned closer to screens. In a classroom in Detroit, a teacher whispered to her students, "This is accountability." In a small cafe in Los Angeles, a man muttered softly, "Why did it take a kid to say this?" Back in the East Room, Malik waited until the final department head sat down. "Thank you," he said simply. No applause followed. It wasn't that kind of moment. Mrs. Amaka Adeyemi felt tears roll quietly down her cheeks. Not because her son had commanded the room, but because he had invited it to be better. Malik looked toward the cameras again. If these actions are completed, he said, people won't remember today because I was president. He paused. They'll remember because something changed. The words were not dramatic. They were sincere. A reporter raised her hand slightly. Mr. President, do you think adults have failed? The question hung in the air like a spark. Malik tilted his head thoughtfully. No, he said gently. I think adults are busy. A faint, startled laugh broke from somewhere in the back. He continued. But sometimes when you're busy, you forget why you started. The room absorbed that quietly. He stepped slightly away from the microphone. I don't have decades, he said softly. I have hours. He glanced at the large clock mounted on the wall. 3 hours left. The number felt smaller now. Not because his authority was fading, but because the weight of it had already shifted. Mrs. Okonkwo stepped beside him. Mr. President, she said quietly, audible through the microphone, your directives are being processed. Malik nodded once. Good. He turned back to the cameras. If you're watching at home, he said, don't just watch. A subtle murmur spread across the room. Ask questions, he continued. Follow up. Remember what was promised today. He paused. Courage isn't loud. It's consistent. In living rooms, kitchens, offices, and classrooms, silence answered him. Not because people disagreed, but because they were thinking. Malik stepped back from the podium slowly. The red broadcast light dimmed. For a long moment, no one in the East Room moved. The nation had not just watched a child speak. It had watched power respond. And in that stillness, something invisible shifted, not in policy alone, but in expectation. For the first time that day, the adults in the room understood something clearly. He wasn't there to borrow authority. He was there to remind them what it was for. By the time the final hour approached, the White House felt less like a monument and more like a living organism, pulsing, adjusting, responding. Malik sat at the resolute desk, his feet not quite touching the floor. The large windows behind him framed the fading orange of a Washington sunset. Papers were stacked neatly in front of him, brief confirmations, preliminary reports, updated summaries. Not decorative folders. Active ones. Mrs. Ifunanya Okonkwo stood across from him. Housing funds have been officially transferred to all 5 cities, she reported. Local agencies are already coordinating emergency placements. Malik nodded slowly. How many families? Initial estimates say over 4,000 individuals will receive immediate temporary housing support. He absorbed that quietly. 4,000. Not a number on a page anymore. People. Somewhere in Chicago, a father unlocked a motel room door for the first time in weeks. In Phoenix, a mother texted her sister, "We're inside tonight." In Philadelphia, a shelter coordinator wiped tears from her eyes as confirmation emails kept arriving. Malik didn't see those scenes. But he felt their weight. And the infrastructure review, he asked. Mrs. Okonkwo handed him another sheet. Preliminary findings show several non-essential modernization contracts can be paused legally. Redirected funds could accelerate safety repairs in at least 12 districts immediately. He looked up at her. Will they do it? She held his gaze. Yes, she said. They will. Not because he forced them. Because now the country was watching. Across the West Wing, staff members moved with unusual focus. Deadlines had been spoken publicly. 30 days was no longer abstract. Reporters still filled the press room. Social media buzzed with clips of Malik's address. Opinion panels debated. Some critics called it naive. Others called it necessary. But no one called it pretend anymore. Dr. Tunde Adeyemi stood near the doorway of the Oval Office, studying his son quietly. Malik looked smaller from this angle, just a child in a large chair. Yet the room felt reshaped around him. "Dad," Malik said softly without turning, "do you think they'll keep their promises?" Dr. Adeyemi stepped closer. "Some will," he answered honestly. "Because they meant it. Others will because people are paying attention." Malik considered that. "Is that bad?" His father smiled gently. "No. Accountability is just attention that doesn't fade." Malik nodded. Mrs. Amaka Adeyemi entered quietly. 15 minutes, she said softly. 15 minutes until midnight. 15 minutes until his temporary authority dissolved. The clock on the wall ticked with unusual clarity. Mrs. Okonkwo stepped forward again. "Mr. President, there's one final update." Malik straightened slightly. "The transparency dashboards are being drafted tonight. Departments don't want to be the first to miss a public deadline." A faint, almost amused breath escaped her. Malik smiled for the first time that evening. "That's good," he said. Outside, the White House gates were lined with onlookers. Some held signs that read "Listen to the kids." Others simply stood in quiet curiosity. In homes across the nation, families remained glued to screens. Not because of spectacle, but because something unexpected had happened. A child had asked clear questions. And adults had answered. 5 minutes to midnight. Malik stood slowly from the resolute desk. The chair seemed larger as he stepped away from it. Mrs. Okonkwo extended her hand. "It's been an honor, Mr. President." He shook it firmly. "Thank you for listening," he replied. She studied him carefully. "Most people in power speak," she said quietly. "Few listen first." Malik didn't respond. He simply nodded. The final minute approached. Staff gathered silently in the Oval Office. Not ceremonially. Not theatrically. Just present. The digital clock shifted. 11:59. Dr. and Mrs. Adeyemi stood on either side of their son. Zara watched from near the doorway, arms folded tightly, not in skepticism, but in fierce pride. The final seconds passed without announcement. No music. No applause. At midnight, Malik Adeyemi was no longer President of the United States. He was just a 10-year-old boy again. The room did not change physically. But something intangible shifted. Mrs. Okonkwo cleared her throat softly. Your authority has concluded. Malik looked at the desk once more. Then he stepped back. That's okay, he said. They began walking toward the exit. As the doors opened into the hallway, reporters gathered respectfully at a distance. One called out, unable to hold back. Malik! What do you want to be when you grow up? The question echoed down the corridor. He paused. He looked up at his mother. She squeezed his hand gently. He turned back toward the reporters. I just want to help, he said simply. No rehearsed answer. No dramatic flourish. Just truth. The hallway fell quiet. Outside, flashbulbs flickered. But inside, the impact had already settled. Within hours, news headlines stretched across the country. 10-year-old issues real directives. Kid president demands measurable accountability. Emergency funds redirected under temporary authority. But the deeper headline wasn't written on any screen. It lived in living rooms where parents began asking questions about local budgets. In classrooms where students debated civic responsibility. In city offices where department heads reviewed deadlines with new urgency. Over the next few days, confirmations continued. Emergency housing placements increased. Infrastructure audits accelerated. Transparency dashboards went live ahead of schedule. Some critics argued the moves were small compared to national challenges. They were right. But small, visible action had triggered something larger. Expectation. A week later, Mrs. Okonkwo stood in a briefing room answering questions from the press. Do you believe the kid president changed policy long-term? A reporter asked. She paused thoughtfully. He changed something more difficult than policy, she replied. He changed what we're willing to accept as normal. Across the country, people remembered his words. Maybe change doesn't only take time. Maybe it takes courage. And in a modest home that felt far quieter than the White House, Malik sat at the kitchen table with his blue spiral notebook open again. The title still read, Questions. He picked up his pencil. Not because he missed the power, but because he understood something now. Authority ends. Responsibility doesn't. His mother placed a plate of sliced fruit beside him. Back to homework, she teased gently. He grinned. Yes. His father sat across from him. Different homework this time. Malik tapped the notebook thoughtfully. Same homework, he said. Just bigger questions. Outside, the world continued spinning, messy, complicated, imperfect. But somewhere within its noise, a new standard had been set. If a child could act with clarity for 24 hours, what was stopping everyone else? And though he was no longer president, the quiet courage he displayed in those hours did not disappear at midnight. It multiplied.